Ellen, this is such a pleasure. Um, like many in our industry, and I think probably many women in the country, I was so proud of you and so enthralled when you started to talk about money. Um, it was such a pleasure to see someone in your position use your platform to talk about issues that impact women across this country and, in fact, in the world at large. So, kudos to you.
Thank you, Nina. It's a pleasure to meet you. We've never met before, so this is a real honor for me. As an entertainment attorney, you definitely fight for your female clients. Um, so thanks for those kind words. I think I'd also be remiss if I don't mention that sitting here as a white woman, being paid the way I am, I have the privilege to be able to open my mouth and speak about it. And so I'm acknowledging my privilege there just from the start because I think that's part of the work that we have to do.
It's so funny because we're on this panel or this discussion where we're talking about gender pay disparity. And I think the title of our discussion here refers to the 82 cents on the dollar that women make with working women make on average. But it also, I know we some of this was in our back and forth as we were preparing for this. It's also about what women across the spectrum make. So I always like to start off by reminding our audience that 82 cents is an average. And in fact, women at the lower end of the spectrum, which is always women of color, particularly Latinas, African American women, indigenous women, all make a lot less. Sometimes, in the case, I think the statistic with respect to Latinas is almost 50 cents on the dollar. So another way of looking at it is that if you are the average Latino woman, it takes you 2 years to make what a non-Hispanic white man makes. Um, and that has been a problem for much of the working life of women in society, in our society. It has always been there, and it unfortunately doesn't seem to be moving as quickly in the right direction as we would like. Can you mind talking a little bit about your own experience of talking about money and how that impacted your life and your place in this movement? And I sincerely see you as a person who's part of this movement to advance women.
Thank you. I will say that, I didn't get here obviously alone. I have a female attorney and I have a female boss. The truth is it's a complicated position I find myself in with respect to the reactions to me speaking about this, about money publicly. And it's complicated for many different reasons. But I think, from where I sit, what's interesting to me is the different reactions I get from, I get, and I'm often labeled outspoken. And then on top of that, I also get told really often, don't speak about money by women and men. Don't speak about your salary specifically, with regards to the show, because that can, that could complicate things. But it runs the gamut. It's not just like I speak about money or I speak about my pay or I think I'm probably safer when I speak about women being paid in the workplace in more general terms. When it's more personally about my situation, I think that gets a little more uncomfortable for people. And then I can suffer some backlash for that. And I have to be very careful about what I say. I was sort of allowed to do it. I had support, which was really key. It's a tricky situation I find myself in talking about my pay scale for a lot of different reasons, but one of them that I mention all the time is that I have a very concrete number that I can attach to Grey's Anatomy. I can see very specifically how much ad revenue or how much the show Grey's Anatomy generates for the Walt Disney Company. So then, my team can go in and base my value off of what they know is generated. Most people don't have that advantage, right? That's a little trickier.
I often felt that I got a much greater pushback when I was aggressive on behalf of women. When I was aggressive on behalf of men, um, it wasn't said as much, but there was a real feeling there that I was doing a good job. But when I was aggressive on behalf of women, I sometimes heard things like, might be getting a little ahead of yourself there, or she might be getting a little ahead of herself, or that's a big number. There are things, and these are things said by people on the other side who are, for the most part, good people, but who are so ingrained in the system of how to value people's worth that it didn't occur to them that they might have been reacting differently on a gendered basis. So that's been my experience. I don't know if that.
No, I mean, and that's so interesting, right? Because gender norms and gender biases have been ingrained in us they start ingraining gender biases and gender norms when we start listening to fairy tales when we're 2 and 3 years old. The story of Cinderella. I have a podcast called Tell Me, and yesterday I interviewed this hilarious best friends that wrote this book called Cinderella, You Bitch. And the whole book is about how fairy tales at the beginning of our lives, these fairy tales that we're introduced to, introduce us to these gender norms that are then in our subconscious. Cinderella had to be, rescued by a man. And of course, he was so dumb, he couldn't even find her by her face. He could only identify her by her shoe. You know, it's let's Sleeping Beauty, let's kiss a woman who's asleep. I mean, how creepy is that?
Right.
So the gender norms and the gender biases have been ingrained in our constitution from when we're small. And so our work really, I think, is as a practice, is to every day recognize where we ourselves fall short and where we're falling into our own biases about ourselves, and make sure that we are doing the work so that we can show up and advocate for ourselves. Not just because we've been told to do it or because we see someone else doing it, but we truly understand our worth and feel confident when we're asking for what we're asking for, which again, you point out, we're very lucky that we have advocates. Most women in the workplace do not have advocates. One area that is I'm very passionate about, and that I follow people doing the work in this field, are farm workers. These women and men, for the most part, are in California. The state of California are Mexican immigrants for the most part, who sometimes travel across the border to get day work, picking our vegetables that our grocery stores are then going to charge us $19 for a little basket of Brussels sprouts that someone has stood in a field in the heat, in the rain, or the sleet, inhaling pesticides, in absolutely no conditions that anyone wants to stand in for a 12-hour day and pick vegetables, and they're paid pennies and not compensated, and they have very little advocacy. So I think about those people. So I think it's important. Perspective is important. And to tie it back to how we started the conversation with acknowledging our privilege, right? There's privilege on all levels. We can always find someone who has a more challenging situation than us. And I think those farm workers are at the very bottom of who's thinking about them, so there's levels to this.
Yeah, and I think part of what you're saying also that's so important, Ellen, is that it's the solidarity that we all have to have with each other. There's this thing in our society that's kind of what this zero-sum thinking. Every time I gain, somebody else gains something, they're taking something away from me. And that's just not true. It's a fiction that's been fed to us by people who are otherwise very successful in their own right. And they're certainly not worried that they're taking away from someone else in their success. And I think the more we understand that we stand with all working women, and even if our own particular situations are secure, they're not secure because our sisters are not secure. And if there's one thing I would love for us to recognize is the interrelationship that we all have, but which isn't, I think, talked about enough and recognized enough. So you're pointing it out is a really important thing, because there's a continuum of working women in this country, and no matter where you fall on that continuum, you are linked to everyone else. So thank you.
Yeah, it's such an important point, Nina. It really is that we are all connected. We are truly all connected, and that is a destructive mindset to believe you're deconstructing any work that's actually been done to believe that because someone else is getting something that we are getting less of that. You could apply that to many situations, to believe that you have the power, just you singularly do have the power to help, because you're going to inspire someone else to speak up, and you're going to inspire someone else to, help someone else. And it's challenging work. It's not like it just happens overnight. I mean, I'm consistently asked to speak about money, and I'm consistently asked to not speak about money. I can speak about money in general, and then but I can't speak specifically about, I'm asked to not speak about money with specifics to my situation. It's a delicate balance.
Oh, that's so absurd, though, because transparency is what we need. We need it so desperately. And not only is it the interrelationship, in the ecosystem, but look at what COVID has done to working women. Why do we lose a generation of progress in a 2-year period? And unless we all put our all of us, and that includes men, all of us put our shoulder, forward, that we really get in there and fight, we have got to make that progress back. And there are so many things that people don't realize are interrelated. I think the sociologist, it was a quote I got that I loved. It says, other countries have social safety nets. I want to attribute this correctly. The US has women. And Jessica Calarco, a sociologist, said that. So because we run into a health problem, a public health problem, that all of a sudden when your children can't be in school, or they can't be in daycare, or daycares can't open because people who operate them are ill or otherwise restricted, then all of a sudden women's progress in the workplace is just so negatively impacted. And I think what we all have to do over these next couple of years is really advocate for child care support for working parents. I mean, working mothers, and particularly working mothers of color, are really out there on their own for the most part. Their children are sick. They have to take off from work. They tend to have jobs where they have to be there in person. All of these things then lead to them making less money. And the last thing I'll say about this making less money, because a lot of people see 82 cents on the dollar and they think, oh my goodness, we're getting close. We're not getting close, guys, because what that means is that you get less Social Security payments into your account, which means when you go to draw on your account in retirement, there is less money paid out to you. So now you go from being a less advantaged working person to a poor retired person. So this affects along the continuum of your life. So those years when you couldn't work because you were looking after your little ones, and I know you appreciate this as a mom, are years that will actually impact those children, because they will be working in part to help take care of you, because you didn't have the ability to put aside the money in a retirement sense, which is one thing, but also the government didn't match you at the highest levels because you weren't making money at the highest levels. So it's this vicious circle that we've got to stop.
I agree with you. I think that, government giving more federal funding or giving the states more money for childcare is really something we should all be trying to work to figure out how we can take part in those discussions, how we can show up better to support the women fighting for that legislation, who's writing that legislation. That's something that I don't know. I couldn't tell you right now who's writing childcare legislation. That's another area that I'm seeing now that I could be possibly involved in, and make advances in that respect. Over COVID, there was something really interesting that happened in healthcare. And I have, obviously an affinity for the healthcare, our healthcare community. And what we saw in healthcare through COVID is in the nursing sector, we saw, and we know that nurses are underpaid and overworked. And before COVID, this was true. And then, during COVID, it was just absolutely abhorrent, the conditions that nurses were meant to work under. Nurses were not, and this isn't specific to women, obviously, there's plenty of amazing male nurses, but nurses were not given COVID tests. There was absolutely no regard for nurses' well-being at all. They didn't care if you were a nurse with COVID. They did not care if you showed up for your shift with COVID. Just show up for your shift. They didn't care that you had to wear the same N95 mask all day long, or 2 days or 3 days or 4 days. There were absolutely no protections. So if we go back to legislation again, and speaking about legislation, and I don't know, this is another area that I'm not so educated about, is the legislative piece. But where is the legislation to impose upon these private sector and these privately owned hospitals that there has to be protections, not just wage protections, but health protections for these workers? Because what happened to nurses, and the nurses got smart, and the nurses figured out, oh, we can be travel nurses. And the nurses just started quitting in droves. And they just said, we are not putting up with this anymore. And so now hospitals are having to contend with travel nursing, and travel nurses come and go. They're on a contract. And if you're a hospital and you don't have any shift nurses because they've all walked out on you, well, now you have to hire travel nurses. So now your cost just went up.
Yes, at a higher
Because,
rate.
it's like, to not do the right thing across the board, for corporations to not do the right thing across the board in the first place. In the end, you're going to cost yourself more money. In the end, you're going to have to make a correction in some way, because when you lose women, you lose. But the truth is who's paying them now ends up paying much more. So it's more cost effective to do the right thing from the start. And then you have more productivity, you have happier workers. So your outcomes are better, especially when we're talking about hospitals, when we're talking about life or death here. Do you really want angry, tired, unwell nurses taking care of your patients? Your outcome numbers are going to be terrible, and your hospital is going to get a terrible accreditation or rating, because your outcomes are poor. So it's the same way when companies do better when they're just naturally inclusive, right? You get a better lens on what's happening. Who are our customers? If you only have white men working on your board, or whether it's your school board, whether it's your company board, you're only getting the lens of what white men see. By being more inclusive and fairer, you're getting all kinds of different opinions that make outcomes better. I mean, basically what this, you could break this down. Women have to advocate for themselves, but corporations and CEOs have to understand that really your profits will go up if you're just structuring things fairly and equally. Your end result is going to be better, for sure, I believe.
Oh, not only do you believe it, but studies have proven this to be true. But when you raise the issue of nursing, which I know you have a special, proclivity for, it's interesting because nursing has often been, for women, the profession that elevates them to into the middle class. Historically, my grandmother was a nurse. In fact, my mother was the only woman of her generation in our family who wasn't a nurse. So because nursing was the thing that catapulted us firmly into the middle class, notwithstanding the fact that they were all well-educated people. And so the question I would ask is, in those years when those unionized nurses are asking for these kinds of protections and these kinds of pay increases, why aren't they being supported? There's such a big anti-union movement in the country now, but when the truth is that unions have really been at the heart of people making these huge gaps and leaps. And I don't know how much of this you followed. I've only, like you, I only have a bit of knowledge about it. But one of the things I noticed in the state of California is nursing schools became more often um, uh, profit run by for-profit institute, companies than by, the public education sector. That was a shift that happened. And so all of a sudden, this profession that is a profession that is dominated by women and that catapults women into the middle class now costs women a lot more to get into. And they're saddled with, greater loan repayment. So everything, I think it goes back to what we were talking about. How do we get past the gender inequities, pay inequities, by looking at the system as a whole and supporting people all along the way? We support the moms and the other working parents. We support women who are trying to gain an education so that they can get a better job. When they have those better jobs, we pay them on an equal basis, and we support them when they ask for a wage that is commensurate with what they are contributing. And all of these things are linked one to another, but we've always been in a place where, even in legislation, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, Ellen, but you know that we have been trying to make women, we've been trying to get rid of the gender disparity since 1963 from a legislative standpoint. How absurd is that? And I just,
It's absurd, and in this particular moment in time, I think it's really frustrating because we see how many things are getting dialed back across the board, from voting rights to women's rights. Right now, we're in a period of despair and regression, and I'm not. Well, I'm not going to say I'm not sure how we got here. I know exactly how we got here. People losing their grip and being terrified that they're losing their grip. And what I will say is, we see this across, we see inequities across for anybody watching this, for any women watching this. The truth is like we said, this exists in all fields, right? Look at the numbers of women in tech. Up in Northern California, in STEM and tech and science, the numbers for women are just lower. So what we need to do is we need to go back to our little, I mean, obviously we want to fix things now, and we want to make progress now for the younger generations. But what we really need to do as mothers and as caregivers and as mentors is make sure that these young women know, and these young men also, I'm not going to be biased about that, young people, we need to make young people aware that we need to erase these gender norms, that's work they need to start doing 5 years old. If I'm gonna let my kids watch fairy tale Cinderella, I'm gonna make sure I'm right there to point out what is wrong with that story. I'm gonna get my pen and my long legal pad and start jotting down all of the list of things that's wrong with this storytelling. And then maybe let's do an exercise where we retell Cinderella. We have to break down the origins of these gender norms that are the foundation that have created all these problems. So we have to attack it from all different angles, I think.
well, I want to say, I was actually there, Ellen, the night that you and Shonda were at the InStyle Awards. And you talked, and Shonda in particular, talked about these issues. One of the things that struck me again is Shonda saying, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to be be bold and proud, and I'm going to talk about myself in ways that I'm not necessarily comfortable in doing so. So I think one of the things that I would love to leave our audience with is this notion that stand up for yourself. It isn't always easy, um, but in doing so, sometimes there's just this unintended consequence that even if you don't get the money, you get the confidence. And I could almost watch that evening. I was kind of watching, and Shonda, who was of course, already in charge, but I kind of looked at her kind of grow in her confidence in that moment. And I've watched you over the years talk about these issues, and thank you for continuing to talk about them even when people don't want you to, because you've shown all of us how important it is. So I say we have to put these issues out front. We have to be transparent about it, and we have to stand in solidarity with our sisters. And guys out there, you need to stand in solidarity with us because it's important for you ultimately. Your life is going to be made easier ultimately by supporting, this notion of equity in a real way. So those are my.
Really important remarks, because two things that you hit on that are really moving to me is get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's a phrase we hear across a few different genres, and it's really powerful. Be comfortable being uncomfortable. It's the only way progress happens. And for people watching, empathy, know that it is uncomfortable, and take a breath and hold your judgment and hold your labels, and know that just because a woman is standing up for herself and seems outspoken or confident, know that that isn't easy.
Yeah, and as men, when women speak up, support them. A woman speaking up and asking to be treated fairly isn't an opportunity for you to treat her worse. That is something that, because I can probably hear women saying, I'm afraid to speak up because this person is so horrible. Well, you know what? We've got to train that person to not be horrible. And the training starts now when they're little boys, or it starts at the beginning.
Absolutely. It absolutely does. And for women too. Women don't get out of this. We can't expect that all women are just going to naturally support us when we speak up. That's just not the case. We say it is, but it really isn't. So
Well, I know they have your support and they have mine, and we'll just, you know what? We're in it. We're in this good fight forever. I know that we are. Thank you so much.
thank you, Nina. This was great. So much fun and great to meet you.